Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Thomas Burr, a Washington correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune and chairman of the National Press Club Board of Governors. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming with events such as this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit www.press.org. To donate to our programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit www.press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes guests of the speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause in our audience, I'd like to note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic integrity. I love that people laughed at that. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. You can follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer period. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Jeffrey Bennett, a political reporter for New York One and Time Warner Cable News, Washington Bureau. Troy Johnson, news anchor, WNEW-FM, and host of WHUR-FM. Roger Van, NAACP Chief Operating Officer and Chief of Staff, and a guest of the speaker. Tracy Blunt, Senior Vice President of the RLJ Companies. Joe Madison, host, SiriusXM Satellite Radio. Leah Epperson-Jealous, Associate Professor of Law and Director of the SJD Program at American University, Washington College of Law, and the wife of our speaker. Skimming over the podium, Jeff Ballou, a news editor at Al Jazeera Media Network and a member of the NPC Board of Governors, who also helped put today's event together. We're skipping the speaker for right now. Nairi Wright, Senior Vice President, MSL Group, co-organizer of today's luncheon and a member of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Joteka Edie, NAACP Senior Advisor to the President and the CEO and Senior Director of Voting Rights. April Ryan, a White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks. Askia Muhammad, News Director at WPFW-FM and Senior Editor at The Final Call. Finally, Jonathan Slant, a political reporter at Bloomberg and a past president of the National Press Club. Our speaker today is Benjamin Todd Jealous, who at 35 became the youngest president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. A mixed-race kid from Pacific Grove, California, Jealous grew up in a family always challenged by the issue of race. According to an interview in Essence magazine, his grandparents faced obstacles dating back to slavery. His mother helped desegregate her high school in Baltimore and joined sit-ins at lunch counters in Virginia. His father told him what it was like to be the lone white guy at a lunch counter sit-in and getting worked over by the police who saw him as a race traitor. As a kid, Mr. Jealous recalls being at a discount store with a black friend and noticing a white lady peeking at them through the pegboard to make sure they weren't stealing anything. Ben Jealous has led a long career in advancing in advocacy, but did you know that he could, at one time, qualify for membership at the National Press Club? Reliable reports say that he once tried a hand at investigative reporting in Jackson, Mississippi at The Advocate, a historically African-American newspaper. But The Advocate had a history of being firebombed, a fact that worried his mother, so that did not last long. Mr. Jealous was also the executive director of the National Newspapers Publishers Association, which represents African-American focused, owned, and operated newspapers. What may have been Mr. Jealous's biggest advocacy challenge is how he courted his wife as a young organizer in New York City and the struggle to keep her and win her over with very little money and a new job in D.C. He succeeded, however, and is married to Leah, a law professor, and the couple has two young children, Morgan and Jackson. But at the core of what Mr. Jealous is speaking about today, yesterday marked the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March in Washington. 5 decades since the Reverend Martin Luther King spoke, the nation has its first black president, but it still faces serious issues for the African-American people, including record incarceration, double-digit unemployment, ballot box suppression, and youth violence. The killing of Trayvon Martin brought back racial concerns to the front pages. The questions remain if the NAACP, like many longtime organizations, is up to the challenge of tackling these issues. The NAACP in recent years has been criticized in the punditry circuit for engaging in symbolic challenges rather than being a louder, out-in-front voice on issues such as the killing of an Australian baseball player by 2 young black men or the alleged beating death of an 88-year-old World War II veteran by a black man. Just this week, the president of the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, Robert Woodson, told a Republican National Committee luncheon that the welfare of black Americans is stuck behind other causes. Everybody has come out in front of them on the bus, gays, immigrants, women, environmentalists, Woodson said. You never hear talk about the conditions confronting poor blacks and poor people in general. With these issues laid before him to address and others, please welcome to the National Press Club, the NAACP President and CEO, Ben Jealous.
To my friend at the RNC, I would encourage him to just listen to what we talk about. With that, I would like to say thank you, President Burr, for that great welcome. Thank you all for being here. I didn't think anybody was going to be here. I was like, oh, what an honor to be invited. Oh, they want me on the Thursday before Labor Day weekend. I'll be talking to the cameras. I'll be like, but no, this is great, and it's a great honor. Somebody who started out their career, really started out their adult years as a reporter in Jackson, Mississippi. This is just a great, humbling honor. I'm pleased today to be here with people who really have helped make me who I am and support me in this work. My wife, Leah, Julian Bond, who has been one of my heroes since I was a small child. Julian's wife, Pam Horwitz. The great members of the NAACP staff, including Joteka Edie, who is leading the charge on our work to secure voting rights across this country. I'm thankful to Jeff Ballou and Nairi Wright for extending this welcome to the Press Club and asking me to be here today, to Ms. Cook and the Press Club staff. 50 years after the March on Washington, it becomes ever more clear the role that the media played and frankly continues to play in informing our conversation about race and often being the conscience of our country. We're grateful, for instance, to the New York Times for the role they have played in challenging the stop and frisk regime in New York City. But today I really want to single out a man who has been my co-captain of the NAACP's national staff for the last 5 years, Roger Vann. Roger is the Chief Operating Officer. And last year, you might recall, there were a lot of questions. Indeed, throughout 2011 and 2012, there were a lot of questions. Would black folks turn out to the polls? Does anybody have a plan? Will black men turn out to the polls in particular? And Roger Vann was the man with that plan, and he got it done in an incredible way. And I just want to say thank you, Roger. We're also joined by my president, the president of the Maryland NAACP, who has racked up the most impressive civil rights string of victories in the country in the past year. Gerald Stansbury is the man who was on point as we moved black voters in support of marriage equality and the DREAM Act, and we took the lead in extending voting rights and expanding restrictions on guns, sensible gun safety reform, and was truly point in abolishing the death penalty last year and completed a campaign that was started by that famous Marylander, Frederick Douglass. So thank you very much. This afternoon I'm going to talk about racial profiling, but I also want to preview the substance of a press release that will go out this afternoon. The NAACP, 5 years ago when I started, the national operation had been in tough times, and frankly, a lot of y'all reported on it. Your publications reported on it. I had a conversation with the Baltimore Sun reported, with the Baltimore Sun's leadership informally the other day, and I said, where are the reporters who cover the NAACP? He said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, when I came here 5 years ago, you had reporters who covered the NAACP, like everything that happened at the NAACP. Where are they? And he said, well, I said, oh, because there's no bad news anymore, right? Well, we have been in the black 5 years in a row. We have increased revenues 10 to 29%, but most importantly, we have gotten serious about organizing people nationally in a very powerful way. We are now the largest online, on mobile, and at the ballot box. We have more than 1.3 million people organized online. We have more than 432,000 people organized on their cell phones. So the largest list outside of the Obama campaign. And we moved more than 1 million new and unlikely voters to the polls, but as far as activists are concerned, we have more than 1.2 million organized voters. That is how we do our work, and that is what gives us the power to do what you've seen us do, whether it's in Maryland or in New York City, where we have worked with a broad range of groups to push Mayor Bloomberg, force Mayor Bloomberg to stop what is the largest local racial profiling program in the entire country. And we just produced a veto-proof majority. Second time in a row. First time for the vote, second time to override his vetoes. And we did that because we are organizing, we are building big, broad, kind of audacious coalitions of people. What Bayard Rustin, the architect of the March on Washington, would refer to as a grand alliance, and we're winning. Today, I want to talk, however, about the history of racial profiling. Because we in this country, frankly, as a young country, have no excuse not to know our own history. And when we forget our history, we repeat our history. And we do so at a great price. Specifically, I want to talk to you today about the last century or so of our national experience with racial profiling. Raise your hand if you remember the DC snipers. Keep it up if you were living here during that time. So was I. And you might recall just how disorienting it was, right? How you were told, if you go to a box store near the Beltway, please just don't walk in a straight line to the front door. You need to zigzag while you go to the front door. And if you're pumping gas, don't stand still. Keep your head moving while you pump gas. And so you got insight into what everybody's personal theme song was, right? Because this is back before, now they often have music playing at the gas pump, but we didn't have flat screens and music playing at the gas pump just 13 years ago, and so everybody had a different beat. And there's this cacophony of people as they pumped their gas. But we did it because we were scared. And the police couldn't tell us who was doing this. And our neighbors kept dying. And so eventually the police felt compelled to put up a profile. Now, a racial profile, but a police profile is put out there when you don't have a description, right? You use a profile in the absence of a suspect-specific description. And the way that profiles work is they start with, if you will, the probable, and they go to the possible, right? So you start with antisocial. Okay, they're killing people. Check. Probably military trained. Well, they're shooting at great distances with precision. Okay, check. Probably traveling alone or in small groups. Well, that's believable. If they were in a big group, you probably would have found them by now. Probably male, probably white. And the police got good at setting up these dragnets. The killings they were happening at rush hour, when there was maximum traffic on the Beltway. And so there was pressure on the police to be efficient with the searches, because you were stopping everybody either from getting home or getting to daycare to pick up their kids or getting into work in the morning. And so I'm sitting there at the water cooler at Amnesty International, and my friend walks in, and he says, Ben, it was the most disorienting thing today. I was driving in. I used to take this long trip into work every Monday, a long trip back home every Friday, and in the midst of that, and the shooting happened, and the dragnet's put up, and next thing I know, I'm on the side of the road, and I have my hands up, and I look to my left, and it's all white guys like me. And I look to my right, and it's all white guys like me. And I said, stop there, brother. You were racially profiled. Why don't we have a beer at lunch, and we can talk about it. In the midst of this, I was in the safest place you could possibly be. It was Saturday night. There hadn't been any shootings that morning or that evening. I was in the center of the city, far from the Beltway, in a basement comedy club with Dave Chappelle. Dave, who's my god brother, my godfather's son, every now and then, he'll just call out to me from stage. When we were in college, I was known as Dave's bodyguard. I wasn't, but I was the big guy who didn't smile much, who stood just behind him. And so there's a little bit of a rapport we have. And so in the middle of his routine, he just yells out, he says, Ben. I said, yeah. He says, I figured it out. I said, what, Dave? He said, when all the dust clears, the DC snipers they're going to figure out are black. I said, why, Dave? He said, brother, because they're taking off the weekend. Dave Chappelle said that, not the president of the NAACP. But here's the crazy thing, in Dave's twisted comedic mind, he was starting at behavior and working his way towards race. And the police, who had my friend on the side of the road, with all those other white guys, were starting at race and working their way towards behavior. And our neighbors kept on dying. And then they arrest John Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. And Chief Moose said at that press conference, we stopped them 10 times. 10 times. Before we looked in the trunk, found the gun. They looked in my friend's trunk. They looked in a lot of white men's trunks. They stopped these 2 black men, one of them wearing a military jacket with his name on it, who smelled, which is a sign to police of being antisocial, because when you're psychotic, you kind of lose track of things, right? They were only bathing once a week at the Silver Spring Y. Antisocial, traveling alone in small groups, military train, check, 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 check. You inject race into the equation, go on through. Go on through 10 times. Raise your hand if you remember Nathaniel Heatwall. Anybody remember Nathaniel Heatwall? No one remembers Nathaniel Heatwall. It happened right at the same time. See, I was paying attention because I was actually writing a report on racial profiling post 9/11 in the midst of the DC sniper attacks. And Nathaniel Heatwall was a student at small college in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he was commuting back and forth to BWI frequently on a small plane. It's at Guilford College. One day he goes through security and he has a box cutter in his backpack and he notices it goes right through. And this is before TSA is really set up. It's sort of those kind of informal years of trying to tighten security, years when guys who looked like me, vaguely, I don't know, Puerto Rican, Arab, I'm not sure what you are, brother, put your hands up. We're gonna search you, right? Getting checked every time, A friend of mine said, chief lobbyist, the NAACP, Hillary Shelton, said, brother, I'm convinced my middle name is random, because every time I ask him why they search him, he said, it's random. Okay. So we're getting searched. Nathaniel Heatwall goes through, backpack goes through, box cutter goes through, and he says, that's weird. I left my box cutter in here, and they didn't. Eventually, Nathaniel Heatwall would go on to take box cutters and modeling putty that on an x-ray looks like plastic explosive, through security onto multiple flights, put them in the vanities in the bathroom, in Ziploc bags, where they stayed for 4 to 6 weeks, until on September 15th, 2003, he wrote an email to TSA saying, this is who I am, this is what I've done, this is what you've never done. You've never found the box cutters going through. You've never found the modeling clay going through. This is where you can find them. They had x-rays, but apparently they were more focused on what Nathaniel Heatwall looked like. Because guys who looked like me, we couldn't even get through the x-ray machine, you know what I'm saying? We couldn't get through the metal detector. Nathaniel Heatwall was able to get box cutters and suspicious-looking substances through and onto multiple flights and into the vanities. And you look at these cases and you think to yourself, well, maybe that's just how we are. Maybe we're just hardwired that way. Maybe race and gender will always infect our ability to discern what's really dangerous. And then you remember Squeaky Fromm. Raise your hand if you remember Squeaky Fromm. For 200 plus years, the Secret Service of the United States and its predecessors had a very similar protocol. Look at everybody in the crowd, but focus on the men. Search the men. The killers are the men. Assassins are the men. Squeaky Fromm took a shot at Gerald Ford. How long do you think it took them to change 200 years of protocol? Whose life did that save when they did? George H.W. Bush. Because about 20 years later, a woman showed up to one of his rallies with a pistol in her purse. And they were doing something they had done for about the last 20 years, but they hadn't done for the 200 years before that. They were checking purses too. And they found that pistol. And so then you say to yourself, well, maybe what we need is just a racial Squeaky Fromm. And so you start searching through the history books, and you find out we had one in 1901. Raise your hand if you remember who was president before Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah, no one remembers. A few guys, thank you. Put those guys on Jeopardy. Everybody remembers Theodore Roosevelt. Most people forget that when Theodore Roosevelt came into the administration, he was vice president, and he was kind of somewhat, who is this guy? This kind of showboat, guy from, fighting wars in Cuba. What elevated him so rapidly was that he was the vice president of a very popular president, President McKinley, who was killed just after he was re-elected. He was to his second term. He was at a Pan-American Exposition type World's Fair event in New York State. And President McKinley was working the rope line. And a man standing at point-blank range at the rope line pumped a bullet into the president's stomach. And just before he could squeeze off a second round, a man in the crowd tackled him, and the bullet glanced off to the side and grazed him. Now, I've done presidential advance and worked with Secret Service and mapping out the event and setting up the rope line and watching them do their thing. And apparently, when you talk to guys, the only thing that's really changed over the years is technology. The protocol has basically always been the same. You search everybody coming up to close proximity, kind of head to toe. Now we use metal detectors. Back then, they would do it by hand. And you have slightly more relaxed based on the distance protocols. So you might imagine that the Secret Service agent in charge of the exposition was pretty perturbed with the guy in charge of the rope line, right? He came right over and he said, how did this happen? You're supposed to search everybody head to toe. This guy walked right through your checkpoint with a gun in his hand, hidden in a crudely faked cast. How did this happen? I said, well, boss, he looked like any other mechanic out for a day at the fair, and looked like he had a bum arm, and we didn't want to hurt him. So we didn't squeeze that cast to feel the steel beneath it. I mean, it wasn't even a cast, really. It was a gauze. It was just a cotton bandage. He said, but boss, I think he had a decoy. Pause here for a second. There was a profile at the time for potential assassins of Western leaders. It was based on the fact that Eastern European anarchists had killed a number of leaders throughout Europe and had warned leaders of the West that they would be next. And the profile was that the person, when you got to sort of the ethnic, racial, physical component, would be swarthy, tall, and with exotic facial hair. So when he said that this guy looked like any other mechanic out for a day at the fair, that was cute. He didn't fit the profile, right? He just looked like anybody else. So they say, go back to the story. He said, boss, I think he had a decoy. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, right behind him, there was a tall man. He was about 6'4", who was swarthy, and he had a long mustache. Exotic facial hair. So well, by all means, he must be easy to find. Fan out, find him, come back. We got good news, we got bad news. Well, what's the good news? The good news is we found the tall, swarthy man with the long mustache. Well, what's the bad news then? How do I say this? That's Constable Big Jim Parker, a light-skinned black retired Georgia constable who tackled the assailant before our boys could get there. Now, it's not as if the world didn't know who Constable Jim Parker was the next day or the day after or for the week after. Because newspapers then were very much like CNN now. Keep running the same story morning and evening till it stops selling. And so for a week, the president was surviving. There was an update on the president every day, morning and night. And there was a little, kind of sidebar about the man who saved the president. And then a week later, they say, perhaps from bad health care, President McKinley died. And Big Jim Parker faded into our distant memory. In other words, we had our racial squeaky from. We had our heads up that racial profiling distracts dangerously. So dangerously that if you inject race and ethnicity into a profile that's otherwise based on behavior, blinders go up and people die, and sometimes it's the President of the United States himself. Race is our issue. Gender, we were able to deal with. Squeaky from, boom. We saved George H.W. Bush. Race, we're stuck. We knew 100 years before the D.C. snipers, while the police let John Muhammad go at least 9 times, because I guess they got him on the 10th, that racial profiles are problematic. The question is, what can we do about it? One, we need to keep doing what we've just done in New York City, where we passed the Community Safety Act and we passed racial profiling bans with real teeth, because what is a failure for national security is a failure for neighborhood security as well. We need to have police focus on people's behavior, not on their race. Consider the op-ed from the New York Times last summer who said that there was a police officer working a neighborhood, and he had a black and Latino neighborhood, and he had a specific suspect description of a rape suspect. And he came across 4 black Latino young ladies sitting on a stoop, and he said to them, "Have you seen this guy?" And they said no. And then he stopped and frisked them. That's the problem with stop and frisk. My grandfather was a probation officer, was in law enforcement for 30 years. He would tell you law enforcement is not that simple. Is not that different from anything else. If you do one thing, you're not doing something else. So you better be doing the right thing. Well, if you're searching for a rape suspect and you decide to stop and check if these 4 girls have a joint in their pocket, you're no longer looking for the rape suspect. And that's why New York City is subpar, according to John Jay University, in solving homicides and solving rapes. Part because they distract their line officers too much. 2, we have got to be aggressive again in our country about doing everything we can to stamp out discrimination. We've got to have a frank conversation about it. We've got to get back to match pair testing and be clear to the young people that are raising up that it's real and they're wrestling with it. There have been studies done. DeVos Pager at Princeton did one. UCLA did another. The one from DeVos Pager at Princeton about 6-7 years ago said it's easier for a young white male with a felony conviction history to find a job than a black male, similarly educated, similar credit score, such, with no convictions. Their history. The white guy with the rap sheet has an easier time than a black kid who's never been to jail. We've got to dig into that. We've got to be clear about it, and we need to stop pretending to the extent that we do that racism is a thing of the past. But the most important thing is we've got to be willing to each open our hearts and shift our mindset. I'll close on this. Years ago, I was in South Central Los Angeles. It was the 10th anniversary of the Rodney King riots. The person speaking just before me was the Honorable Jack Kemp. And Jack was on fire that day. Jack was talking about our kids, our kids, our kids. He was clearly talking about the kids at the schools in the neighborhood. And there's an older black woman standing next to me in the wings, waiting to go out just after me. And she said, Ben? I said, yeah. She said, where's he from? I said, ma'am, that's Jack Kemp. I know who he is. Where's he from? I said, he ran as Republican for president. I know what he did, boy. Answer my question. Where is he from? I said, ma'am, I don't know, but I don't think it's South Central, if that's your question. That's the point. She said, yeah, I didn't think so. She said, well, then whose kids is he talking about? And I said, ma'am, I think his point is that they are all our children because we are all Americans, and they are all American children. And she said, huh. And then she thought about it. And that's what we need to think about. Try it. Try it for a week. Try describing a child you read about in the newspaper or you wrote about, just to your family, without using all the adjectives. And just saying one of our kids, or this American kid. See how hard it is. See how ingrained it is in us to basically dehumanize something that came into the world as perfect, a child, before we get around to talking about what the story actually was. Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. I'm happy to take your questions. God bless.
Good work out there. Thank you. Given what you said about racial profiling, a questioner wants to know, if we set aside the moral debate, does racial profiling have any utility in a national security or even a local neighborhood security system?
Well, I hope that's really was and I understand that the questions were written before the speech was given, but I hope that my speech got to that point. Racial profiling is problematic because it's morally wrong. Racial profiling is unconstitutional. That should be the end of the conversation. Racial profiling also is ineffective from a law enforcement perspective. There is something in my background, part inspired by my grandfather's work and his influence on me. My academic background is in criminology. That's what I invested my Rhodes Scholarship in. And there's this notion called, there's a theory called carnival theory. And it explains basically how terrible things happen when a well-funded network is involved. It can be a drug shipment, it can be a dirty bomb. And what they say is, look, when you have a network that has resources, significant resources, whether it's human or whether it's financial, ultimately they can get a number of people who appear very differently to accept the mission. And before they deliver the actual package, they often send decoys to see who gets through and who gets stopped. And that's why it's not surprising. Jose Padilla, or the shoe bomber, or the young Jewish American convert to Islam spokesperson that Al-Qaeda had for some time, that we see this diversity in the actual folks who either carry the message or carry the weapon. And so we have to understand that if you use a racial profile, you're giving the enemy a formula for success.
Thank you. On the same subject, New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly says that beneficiaries of stop and frisk are overwhelmingly members of minority groups. He says without that policy in place, quote, people who live in minority communities, end quote, are more likely to be homicide victims in the future. What's your response?
Ray Kelly should remember what he used to say. What he said about a decade ago, that taking credit for a drop in crime was like taking credit for an eclipse of the moon. Or when he referred to stop and frisk as dubious, tough-on-crime tactics. Ray Kelly, simply put, was against stop and frisk before he was for it, and he was against it for all the right reasons.
Julian Bond, who's a guest in our audience today, says that voter ID laws are rolling back civil rights gains since the March on Washington because they're targeted at blacks and other minorities. Do you agree?
Read that carefully before. Yeah, I do.
What are some of the biggest challenges you face navigating reform of racial profiling practices?
Probably the biggest obstacle I've faced in New York, has been in New York City, and the willingness of Mayor Bloomberg to resort to scare tactics. And I really hope at some point he'll look into his heart and apologize for what he's done. There is no statistical evidence to back up his claims that people will die if we end racial profiling. What he has chosen to do is what demagogues have chosen to do again and again in history, which is to strike fear into the hearts of people, to try to force them to go in their direction rather than wrestle with the facts. When you look at the facts, the decline in homicides in New York City peaks during the Dinkins administration, begins to fall during that administration, falls all through the Giuliani administration. It goes from about 2,400 down to well under 1,000, I think about 800, 900. And then it continues to fall during the Bloomberg administration over the next 10 years. But there's important things to understand about that. First, 3/4 of the drop in homicides occurred before 2002. Second, the massive increase in stop and frisks happened after 2002. Third, during the Bloomberg administration, crime in New York City falls by about 29%. The same time in Los Angeles, it fell by 59% while they were fighting racial profiling. There is no statistical evidence for Mayor Bloomberg's claims. His resorting to scare tactics was a shame because he is the mayor of the largest city in the country, because he is one of the wealthiest men in the city, because he is one of our few true media moguls. He, for all those reasons, bears significant responsibility to stick to the truth. In this case, he deviated it in ways that slandered an entire generation of New York City's children, and it's just not acceptable.
Switching back to a subject you had talked about earlier in your speech, in terms of the petition that has been circulating regarding the Trayvon Martin case and the NAACP's efforts, where does the NAACP stand, and has there been any progress moving towards a civil suit?
For the civil suit, I would refer you to Ben Crump. That's a decision of the family, and he's the attorney who's really involved in that. We have been pushing for civil rights charges to be brought against Mr. Zimmerman, not unlike they have been brought against officers, for instance, after the Rodney King case and so many other instances. The DOJ is doing exactly what they should be doing, which is taking their time, making sure they have all the facts, putting things together. Some of the facts that are in front of them are, I believe it was witness number 9, 6 or 9, I think it's witness number 9. Anyways, the witness who was the member of George Zimmerman's own family, who called in just days after and said that her family member, George Zimmerman, she believed acted in a way that was racially motivated, that he had done racist things before, said racist things before, and she also said that he had committed crimes against her when she was a child. Things that come up are those young boys who lived in that gated community with him who said that they believe that he targeted them because of their race. Things that come up are the pattern of calls that he made over the years. We don't think you have to say N-I-G-G-E-R to T-R-I-G-G-E-R civil rights charges. And in this case, we have recently delivered 1.7 million signatures to DOJ from a very diverse range of people in this country who feel the same way, with another 219,000 from Color of Change. It's about 2 million that they've received in recent weeks.
Staying with this for a minute, what specifically is the NAACP doing to address the stand your ground laws that are popping up or are already established in several of the states?
We are focused. In this century, the reality is that the primary tool of civil rights advocacy has shifted. In the last century, it was primarily federal litigation. In this century, because of devolution, because of a lot of things, it is primarily state-level legislation. And so our folks across the country are focused on finding bill sponsors to introduce repeals of stand your ground laws. We are very pleased that in the meantime, they've been very successful in blocking any new ones from being passed.
On the Trayvon Martin case, it seems every once in a while there are issues that pop up that bring race back to the front pages, as we discussed. Does it take something like that to actually spur action, or can something be done without some horrible tragedy happening to actually make people pay attention?
Again, Gerald Stansberry and the Maryland NAACP, just kind of case in point, are a good example of how we get work done even in the absence of a horrible case. Passing marriage equality, abolishing the death penalty, extending voting rights, and so forth. With that said, the role of cases is often to galvanize millions of people and disproportionately particular generations. You might notice, if you talk to an older friend, say my mom or my grandmother's age, every now and then they might slip and say Till when they mean Martin, right? You know, Mr. Till, and they admit, because it's the same thing in their soul, but it's two different cases. Talk saying my generation, they might slip and say Rodney King or Amadou Diallo when they're talking about Trayvon Martin. And so this generation has been baptized like other generations. But what's true about activism is that oftentimes the most horrible cases are the gateways to a great cause. And so people come in to the movement, they come into the struggle because they're outraged over a case of somebody that they identify with, but they stay in because they see that when we work together, we can get a lot of great things done on that issue and on many other issues that they care about.
Turning to politics a little bit, what do you think so many state Republicans in state legislatures have enacted voter ID laws? And is that turning black voters away from the Republican Party to a point where they may never come back?
You know, look, I don't claim any special knowledge into the minds or hearts of men. I go by what they say. And Representative Turzai, GOP leader in Pennsylvania, made it very clear that he was pushing voter ID to skew the vote in favor of Mitt Romney and ostensibly all future Republican candidates. What we know is that voter ID disproportionately impacts young people of all colors because they're disproportionately poor, and people of color of all races because they're disproportionately poor and therefore more likely to move frequently or have an out-of-date ID or not own a car and therefore feel like they don't need a driver's license or so forth. To the other question about the RNC, like Mr. Bond, I grew up in a family with a great sense of history. And a part of that history was a deep appreciation for the party of Lincoln and the role it had played historically. My daughter is named for Peter G. Morgan, who was born a slave and was in the first class of blacks in the Virginia House of Delegates, and is my grandfather's great-grandfather. And she could have been named for my grandmother's grandfather, had played a very similar role. They were both Republicans. The Republican Party has a proud legacy when it comes to civil rights. But they made a Faustian bargain about 40 years ago with the Southern Campaign. And they're now being called to reckon for it because our country is becoming majority people of color, and they need to ask themselves, can they survive with that bargain? Or do they need to go back to their deeper roots and be not just the party of Lincoln, but the party of Frederick Douglass as well? When I look at Republican governors out there, you have the makings, if you put their different planks together, of a great GOP civil rights agenda. You have Alabama, where they're pushing for early childhood education. You have Georgia and Texas, where they're downsizing the prison system. You have Virginia, where they believe in second chances, whether it's employment or in voting, and so on. Unfortunately, the party isn't there yet, but I believe that as our country continues to evolve in the ways that we get closer to the vision that great Republican Frederick Douglass laid out when he said, and let me just give a couple more seconds in this. He said in his speech, our composite nationalities, it's a little bit of a rough paraphrase, but it's pretty close to the verbatim, that every country has a destiny, and its destiny is based on its character, and its character is defined as how it is at its best, not its worst, and its character is influenced by its geography, and our geography is unique. We are bordered by two oceans that connect us to every planet, to every country on the planet, and two borders that connect us to nations themselves of very different races. And our destiny, based on our character, based on that geography, is to be the most perfect example of human unity that the world has ever seen. That was yesterday's Republican Party. If that becomes tomorrow's Republican Party, they could have a very good century. If it does not, if they say stuck where Bobby Jindal says they are stuck, their party will fall apart.
Speaking of, all but 2 Republican senators voted for passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, but no Republicans were present yesterday at the March on Washington 50th year anniversary. Given what you just told us, what does that say about the focus on the Republican Party?
You know, I would have liked to have seen Republican speakers at that, and I do believe, as I said, that there are messages that could have been brought. What I'm most heartened by was the message that Sensenbrenner delivered to a Republican gathering in recent days over at the RNC headquarters, talking about his commitment to restoring Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. I'm heartened by the signals that Majority Leader Cantor has sent that he might be willing to support the same thing. And I'm hopeful that Mr. Boehner will look into his heart and, more importantly, look into the eyes of John Lewis and recognize that on this one, any sort of recent tradition of we don't put anything forward unless the majority of the party is in alignment, that in this case, it might be worth to let that be the exception that proves the rule and actually depart and let the majority of the U.S. Congress have its voice heard. Because we believe that when the time comes for the vote, the majority of the U.S. Congress will be prepared to restore Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act.
If you were to pick up a newspaper 50 years ago today, you would have found Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech on page A15. I believe in the Associated Press version of the story, it was like the 19th paragraph. What would you say is the most strikingly similar situation today in which the news media is missing the big story because it's consumed with an angle based on preconceived notions?
That's a good question. You know, I think that how we talk about our young people generally, how we talk about young people of color in particular. It's the president of the NAACP, an organization that's active in 1,200 communities, that nurtures and transforms young people into leaders with great success in those communities. I'm always struck by how, even when it comes to our young people, our media too often is guided by rules at best we should only apply to adults. You know, we focus on the negative, we focus on the violence, we focus on the sex, we focus on all those things, and in the process we encourage ourselves to be afraid of our own children. And if there's a story that we're missing, you look at the Dream Defenders in Florida, you look at the young people in the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, you look at the geniuses in our AXO program, the mathematical whizzes who win the math component of that Olympics we put on in our convention every year, and you realize that there is leadership and power and genius in our young people that we ignore too often, and we fail to, therefore, to acknowledge and therefore encourage. And our country actually has a vested interest in just the opposite.
Congressman Lewis is the last surviving speaker from the March on Washington from 1963. Julian Bond, who's in the audience today. Who would you say are among the next generation of civil rights leaders?
Oh, geez. You're about to get me disinvited to a whole bunch of holiday parties. You know, what I would say is that there are people in states across this country who are doing incredible work that the national media should pay attention to. If you cover criminal justice, you should know Dr. Yanez Correa, the head of the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, because last year she passed, working with the NAACP, bringing the NAACP and the Tea Party and the legislators who support both together, 12 progressive criminal justice reform bills, or they would say sensible or something on the right wing, so effective that Texas is projecting to shut down its first prison ever. And this year she passed 50. It shouldn't take such effort for Reverend Barber of North Carolina to become well known. He has been leading people there and coming together with great success for a decade or more. You should know Adora Obi-Nwezi, the president of the Florida State Conference of the NAACP, who last year, when the sheriffs showed up the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day to try to put her people and representatives of Rock the Vote and League of Women Voters and others in jail, because the new law said that if you had your voter registration forms out of the clerk's office for more than 48 hours, you were either going to jail or paying a fine. And many other groups shut down and filed a lawsuit and said, we're not going to take this risk. She took the risk anyway. And she led her group in registering more than 120,000 new voters, who we know from our own polling voted about 93% for the president, and the president only won Florida by 60,000 votes. And there's an old woman in a big hat and a wheelchair who's responsible for that. The story is in the states right now when it comes to the change of our country. And the heroes are in the states too. And the people that we know nationally, that we will know nationally 20 years, will invariably be people like Derek Johnson, the Mississippi NAACP, who's doing great work. Or people like the young people that Gerald is training. These are folks who are winning transformative victories. They are people who stood up when even their own allies said, we could not win marriage equality in Maryland, and said, no, we can.
President Bill Clinton said yesterday, admonished those who were assembled yesterday at the march to stop whining about the political gridlock in Washington because it's nothing new. What legislative goals is the NAACP pursuing which could garner, in your opinion, bipartisan support?
Voting rights, voting rights, voting rights. Voting rights, voting rights, voting rights. Should not be partisan, and Sensenbrenner and, again, signals from Kansas suggest hopefully it will not be when it comes for a vote. As do the actions of the governor of Michigan last year when he vetoed a voter ID bill. There was a story that was largely missed. And the actions even of Governor McDonnell when he kicked a big dent in a century-old ban on formerly incarcerated people voting in Virginia by re-empowering the nonviolent offenders, about 200,000 of them, to vote. But criminal justice reform is the big untold bipartisan story. There's been some recent fascination with right on crime, and they're doing great work. And there's a flip side to that, as you might imagine, which is the entire civil rights community that's been working with them in states across the country to get these reforms through. You know, people, whether it's Rick Perry in Texas who signed these bills, or whether it's Governor Deal in Georgia who's played a more active role, a decade from now, we will have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of families that are grateful because these very large prison systems are being aggressively redesigned in a way that will result in the most dangerous people being in prison, but other folks like nonviolent drug offenders who every study suggests it's 7 times more effective dollar for dollar for us to use rehab than incarceration, will be in rehab and not in prison, and their family won't have been broken up, and their kids won't be in foster care and being accelerated towards prison themselves.
I'm going to bifurcate this question a little bit. There's been some criticism that from the punditry circuit, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, about the NAACP not speaking out when there are black on white crime, such as the young black man who beat up the World War II veteran allegedly in Washington State. What do you say to that criticism, and also to the concern that the NAACP has fractured its has a fractured goal because there's so many issues like immigration or gay rights or other issues that you're also pursuing?
The first one I would say, look, we are often, that case happened fairly recently. From what we can tell, people were arrested quickly, and there's not clear evidence that there was a racial motivation. The national is often criticized for being slow on cases because we let things take their pace at the local. We let the local inform the state, inform the national as far as our own structure. And so we were criticized, for instance, not moving fast enough on Trayvon Martin as well. But we take our time. And we got so outraged about Trayvon Martin, let's remember, because somebody killed him and he wasn't put in jail. And that person's own family member had come out and said that they believed race was a factor. Trust me, if those factors, like that were at play in the Washington case, and we took our appropriate time, we would speak out in the same way. We have stood up, and we do stand up when white people are the target of hate crimes. Oftentimes it's because they're LGBT. And we, in many places, aren't just the sort of, if you will, the civil rights organization rooted in the black community. We're the only civil rights organization in those communities. And we championed the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd hate crimes bill. That's an example about our kind of wide set concern. That concern, the breadth of our concern has existed from the very beginning. Let's be clear, the word Negro meant black in 1909. The word colored meant what people of color means today. Now, oftentimes, all the coloreds were Negroes, too, in that area, and so they became synonymous for some people. But for those people like W.B. Du Bois, there was an important distinction. Just like in any place there might be people of color, they might all be black today. W.B. Du Bois walked into an NAACP board meeting about a year after we were founded and says, we have to change our name. Now, if you've ever been involved in a voluntary organization, there's a lot of things you have to do in your first year. One of them is not change your name. At the time, our name was the National Negro Association. And Du Bois said, in effect, our mission is broader than that. Our mission is to overturn the system that says that one group is on top and everybody else is on the bottom. And he was thinking about Ireland, he was thinking about India, he was thinking about a whole world in which he was involved with leaders in the entire continent of Africa. And he said, our issue at bottom is with white supremacy. And so the name of the new organization was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He didn't want to push white people down. He wanted to lift everybody else up. Frederick Douglass, about 50 years earlier, had said, if you believe majorities matter, and I believe they do, then it should matter that 4/5 of the world is colored and only 1/5 white. He wasn't talking about black folks. He was talking about people of every other color who were locked out by notions of white supremacy. That's where we start. Roy Wilkins was on fire when people tried to slander Bayard Rustin going into the 1963 March in Washington, and said it motivated him, slandering Bayard Rustin because he was gay, motivated him to turn out that many more buses. Right after the March on Washington, when we got done with the Civil Rights Act, around the time we're pushing through the Voting Rights Act, we also got rid of the Europe-only preference. We're part of the coalition, that grand coalition that Bayard Rustin put together. We were all together. We got rid of the Europe-only preference for immigration to this country. We have always been for sensible, comprehensive immigration reform. The new NAACP is nothing but a renaissance of the old NAACP. We've been multiracial and multi-faith from our founding, and we've always had an outlook broader than the black community, and yet fueled by the anger and the experience that the specific oppression of black people in our society generates, and the perspective that it sears in your soul, that in order to have friends, you got to be a friend, and in a democracy, in order to win, you got to have a lot of friends.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. Before the last question, I have a couple housekeeping matters. First of all, I'd like to remind you about our upcoming events and speakers. On September 7th, the National Press Club will host the 16th annual Beat the Deadline 5K, which benefits the Press Club Institute's diversity scholarships. The race features Tony Horton, creator of the P90X, and Erica Gonzalez, an NBC4 reporter, as celebrity race marshals. For more information, go to www.press.org. On September 10th, we have Dr. Thomas Frieden, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. On September 17, the Honorable Mary Fallon, Governor of Oklahoma and Vice Chair of the National Governors Association. On November 11th, Walt Bettinger, President and CEO of the Charles Schwab Corporation. And before I ask the last question, I would like to present Mr. Jealous with the National Press Club traditional mug.
Thank you. This will go right next to the ones I've stolen from Face the Nation and Meet the Press. Thank you very much.
Last question. If Dr. King were with us tonight, today, beyond the obvious of having the nation's first black president, what one thing do you think that Dr. King would be very proud of?
On this particular day, I think Dr. King would be very proud that today, in dozens of cities across this country, hundreds of job sites, thousands of people, primarily young people, walked out demanding that they receive more than $7.25 per hour. Because you can't survive on $7.25. Indeed, you can work 50, 60 hours a week and still qualify for public assistance. Dr. King, in his heart, understood that even with all the other isms that we deal with, that sort of nameless ism that we have in too many of our hearts against the poor in this country is what wounds us most broadly. And his last campaign, the Poor People's Campaign that he never quite finished, he intended to go to jail for years after massive civil disobedience to wake us up to the sinful tolerance we have for the suffering of our fellow hard-working citizens in this country. If you haven't listened to the voices of those people who are walking out in cities across this country today, I encourage you to go online and to listen to them. They are inspiring. For all of us who, like myself, have benefited because somebody in their family way back was, helped form a union, and wages went up and generations went to college as a result. They are those people for generations unborn. And they are the ones who will make sure, who are trying, putting their body, their life, their very ability to pay the rent on the line to make sure that our country isn't just made more equitable from the top down, but from the bottom up as well.
Thank you, Mr. Jealous. Thank you, Mr. Jealous. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including the Journalism Institute and the Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. Finally, here's a reminder you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of today's program, please check out our website at www.press.org. Thank you. We are adjourned.